I want to thank Shabir for coming to this debate, and I want to thank James for providing this forum. Because time is limited, we're going to get right into the substance of the matter. I want to talk to you about the historical credibility of the Gospel's portrait of Jesus. We'll get into the numerical stuff and the relevance of that in the rebuttal section, but I want to consider first the nature of our principal sources. When we evaluate a question like the origin of the Gospels, the issue that we should consistently have in mind is the simplicity of our explanatory model relative to the shape of the historical data, whether that data is the internal evidence of the Gospel text or the external evidence of early witnesses to their origins. Whether or not we can construct an historically possible scenario where the Gospels are anonymously produced by non-eyewitnesses, the real question, especially in inductive disciplines like history, is whether the evidence we have takes the shape we would expect if the four biblical Gospels were produced anonymously by non-eyewitnesses. As M.B. Thompson points out in his article, The Holy Internet, the evidence from the first 2 centuries suggests a degree of integration and cheap, safe travel across the Roman Empire and across the network of churches that was not matched again for centuries, possibly not until the late Middle Ages and Renaissance era. Contrary to the imagined world of form and source critics, the actual textual data from early Christian texts undermines powerfully the idea that the Jesus tradition was transmitted orally and anonymously over generations before it came into the textual world of the canonical Gospels. Moreover, as Larry Hurtado has shown in recent scholarship, the actual character of the early Christian manuscript tradition reveals a powerful and striking unity of distinctive qualities. Though the vast majority of our second century texts are written in scrolls, over 70% of second century codices, that is what we basically would call a modern book, are of Christian origin. It appears that across the entire network of Christian churches, Christian scribes pioneered the use of the codex. Moreover, the first 3 centuries reveal the widespread and now universal use of what scholars call the nomina sacra, where names associated with God and Jesus would be specially abbreviated and underlined in order to accentuate the sacred character of the divine name, which also has implications for the divinity of Jesus. Such scribal treatment of divine names has its closest parallel not in Hellenistic culture, but in Judaism. And this suggests an integrated culture of manuscript transmission where a certain family of texts, that is the biblical texts, were treated as especially sacred from a very early period. As Michael Kruger has argued, this indicates a striking unity of the Christian world and an extremely early concept of canonical normativity. In the world where the 4 canonical Gospels circulate anonymously and are given their titles later to buttress their divine authority, would one expect them to be attached to these authors? The first and the most popular of the Gospels is attributed by tradition to Matthew. The association of a Gospel with Matthew in our extant sources is first explicitly made in Papias. Matthew's claim to fame as an apostle, however, is the very fact of his being associated with a written Gospel. Similarly, early Christian scribes, whose goal was to link their anonymous Gospels with a normative authority, would have virtually no reason to select Mark as the author of the second Gospel. Now, Papias identifies the Gospel of Mark as connected with the preaching of the Apostle Peter. And Papias himself was intimately connected within the early apostolic circle and was a disciple of John the Apostle. Latinisms in the text corroborate the early association of the Mark's Gospel with the city of Rome and Peter's preaching therein. Now, the third Gospel was traditionally written by an author who, again, status is linked to his tradition of being linked with the authorship of the Gospel himself. He's not remembered as a disciple of the historical Jesus, and his principal association with an apostle is Paul, who, of course, was not a disciple of Jesus during his earthly ministry. While Irenaeus is the first to list the 4 Gospels explicitly by their traditional authors, there exists no competing tradition, either in our external evidence or in the manuscripts themselves. Despite the common claim that the Gospels are internally anonymous, these manuscripts, which have the beginning of the text, all associate the 4 Gospels with these traditional authors. If they are anonymous, they are only anonymous in the sense that any writing which does not begin with, "Hello, I'm John Doe, the author of this text," is anonymous. Most of my writing would be anonymous by the standard. It's easy to claim that the texts are anonymous if we decide that the very portion of the manuscript identifying our authors doesn't count. Relative to the data in hand, by far the most simple and parsimonious explanation identifies the 4 Gospels as written by their traditional authors. And if this is the case, these 4 Gospels represent extremely early tradition coming from the most intimate acquaintances of the historical Jesus. Moreover, the closely integrated network character of the earliest Christianity and its universal veneration of the apostles is strongly at odds with any model claiming that these gospels would have been contested by the historical apostles of the historical Jesus if they were acquainted with their content. That they are taken to be normative at such an early date across the Christian world is best explained if they represent historical information of the highest value. Now let's look at what's inside these four texts. The four Gospels are consistent with each other in remarkable and non-ostentatious ways, indicating that the portrait being presented is rooted in the actual historical Jesus. A detail in one Gospel explains in subtle ways details in the other Gospels. Things that appear to be contradictory actually come into sharp focus as intelligible only in light of very specific information about the local geography of the region. Moreover, the Gospels get things right that would be nearly impossible to fake. Indeed, these tests can only be made because of contemporary historical tools allowing us to collate and analyze data from a wide variety of contemporary texts. Imagine living 2,000 years ago and producing an invented narrative from 38 years prior. Frequency of personal names fluctuates consistently in both time and place, and the world of the narrative is not the production context for the actual authorship of the four Gospels. That is, where the history happened is not where the texts were written. Compiling data from the Dead Sea Scrolls and other contemporary sources, Richard Balcom notes that the relative frequency of names, even when considering only Jews, differs vastly from place to place. The most common names in Palestine were not the most common names in Egypt or in Libya. And yet, despite being produced outside Palestine, the four Gospels represent very exactly the appropriate proportion of names relative to its purported geographical and chronological setting. When one considers that this question can only be meaningfully asked because of modern scholarly tools, the idea that the evangelists would have been able to produce this correlation artificially is revealed as absurd. Similarly, their knowledge of the topography is extremely accurate. John chapter 2, for example, describes a journey down to Capernaum from Cana, reflecting the actual higher elevation of Capernaum relative to Cana. The same language is used accurately in describing the relationship of Jerusalem to Jericho. And when Jesus prophetically condemns Chorazin, Bethsaida, and Capernaum, he condemns three obscure communities, which are actual first century Palestinian towns. Chorazin is archaeologically known as being on the road to Bethsaida and existing 2 miles north of Capernaum. This contrasts with later non-canonical Gospels, which name only the largest and most well-known cities. And the canonical Gospels mention about 70 to 80 place names each. They consistently reflect accurate knowledge of the topography. Other connections among the Gospels reflect a whole that is larger than the minds of the authors and is rooted in historical reality. For example, only John's Gospel provides information permitting us to see the length of Jesus' ministry as 3 years through its 3 Passovers. Yet in Luke's Gospel, Jesus tells a riddle of a man who had been seeking fruit on the tree of Israel for 3 years to explain his own action. These texts are unified in terms of an external world transcending literary creativity. Mark's Gospel identifies the grass in the feeding of the 5,000 as green, a distinctive feature of the region only in the springtime around Passover. Yet it's only John's Gospel which specifies the Passover context of the miracle. In Luke 9, the feeding of the 5,000 took place near Bethsaida, and according to John 12, a passage unrelated to the feeding, Philip is from Bethsaida. And that explains why in John 6, Jesus asks Philip where they might go to buy bread. The way in which the Gospels explain each other underscores the reality that they transcribe very precisely actual history in both the Synoptics and John's Gospel. Jesus identifies himself with the vine in John alone, and we know from archaeological data that there was, in fact, a vineyard that they would have been passing on the path they were traveling to Gethsemane. Mark's Gospel tells the story of Herod's execution of John the Baptist in some detail, reflecting either intimate awareness of his death or an inventive mind. But it's in Luke's Gospel, in 8 verse 3, that Joanna, the wife of Chuza, was a disciple of Jesus, and we're told that she was Herod's household manager, thus explaining how this information was available to Mark. In Jesus' trial, narrated in the Synoptics, he's accused of saying that he would destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days. Yet it's only in John that we learn of Jesus saying that he would rebuild the temple in 3 days if it were destroyed at the beginning of his ministry. The garbled memory of an authentic saying of Jesus that is misquoted in his trial provides explanatory context, unifying the stories of the 4 Gospels and John together. Observe how these undesigned coincidences exist in both the natural and the miraculous aspects of Jesus' ministry and hold true both before and after his resurrection from the dead. For example, when Jesus asks Peter, "Do you love me more than these others do?" We're given an explanation for why he asks that only in the Synoptic Gospels, where Peter says, "Even if the others fall away, I will not." Third and finally, I want to consider the portrait of Jesus that emerges from the Gospels in the terms of what N.T. Wright calls the criterion of double dissimilarity and similarity. Jesus carried out his ministry in the historical world of first century Judaism and must make sense in that context. Yet he also gave birth to an early Christianity which had specific characteristics. He has to make sense as someone in the first century Jewish world without being identical to it, and he has to make sense as the explanation for why early Christianity took the specific form that it did. The Jesus of the Gospels acts specifically in ways which only make sense against his historical context, and likewise explains why early Christianity believed the things that they do without speaking in the language of the earliest Christianity. Consider the fact that in early Christianity, we know from the book of Acts, from the writings of Paul, that the principal controversy in the earliest period was about circumcision of Gentiles. Now, if the evangelists felt free to invent material in order to give them a leg up in their theological controversies, why does Jesus never once address this controversy? But he addresses all sorts of things which were not, in fact, controversial in the early church. The theology of the New Testament emerges out of the teaching of Jesus and makes sense in the context of his historical ministry, and yet it also explains why early Christianity spoke the language that it did without merely being a retrojection of first century Christianity. In both the Synoptics and John, Jesus' teaching about his own redemptive work is couched in the language of first century Jewish expectation. He organizes his followers around 12 apostles, representing the focal point of the reintegrated 12-tribe kingdom with himself as its Lord. His miracles constitute enacted riddles about the nature of his work, which coheres with the substance of Christian teaching, but departs in its mode of elucidation. Like the cursing of the fig tree, an enacted parable about the judgment of Israel, Jesus' healing of lepers, cripples, and the woman with an outflow of blood are more than demonstrations of power. Indeed, they specifically identify Jesus as the focal point of divine presence and the one who ritually purifies those associated with death and ritually purifies them so that they might have access to the temple, which is what purity is all about. He enacts parabolically the reality of his divine identity, but he does so in a way which only makes sense in the world of first century Judaism. With the public exaltation of Jesus, the right hand of God, there was no more reason to be cryptic, and so the New Testament proclaims his divinity openly. But in the Gospels, Jesus teaches his parables so that only those with open ears and soaked in Israel's scriptures will understand. Controversies about healing on the Jewish Sabbath are present in both the Synoptics of John, and they only make sense in the setting of Jesus' ministry. Not only would this debate have been foreign to the earliest Gentile Christian communities, but it represents an earlier period in Jewish halakhic discussion than that found in post-70 AD text. The Jerusalem Talmud, for example, describes how there were multiple parties of Pharisees, and indeed the Jerusalem Talmud condemns most of these Pharisaic parties as a curse because of their legalism. The use of parables is pervasive in the Synoptic Gospels, and yet as a teaching style, it is essentially absent from the Gentile Christian literature, but present in a wide variety of Jewish literature. The epistles and the apocalypse speak openly about Jesus' atoning death, the new birth, and the consequent presence of the Holy Spirit among them. They consistently identify Jesus as Kyrios, or Lord, translating the tetragrammaton, the divine name, from the Old Testament. And yet when Jesus speaks about his coming death, he does so in riddles, like in the parable of the tenants, where the guardians of the field kill the son of the master who owns the field. In this parable, Jesus' death is presented essentially as that, like a martyr, like the Israelite prophets. It doesn't openly elucidate a detailed theology of atonement. It makes sense as something the historical Jesus would have said, not as something which the Gentile Christians would make up. Likewise, when Jesus is accused of blasphemy at his trial, he's accused in the context of his combination of Daniel 7 and Psalm 110. Daniel 7, he is the Son of Man, and yet, according to Psalm 110, he is seated. He thereby identifies himself with the seated figure of Daniel 7, and in combining these two texts, he uses a well-known Jewish method of exegesis. It's cryptic relative to the later Christian literature, but it makes sense in Jesus's own context. In a variety of ways, from a multitude of perspectives, the simplest way of explaining the actual data of the Gospels is by identifying them as accurate historical records, memoirs of the apostles, which record things that happened in first century Judaism. The real Jesus is the Jesus of the Gospels.